The carriage stopped at the top of a hill where the road gave out, and Rosalind Hale saw for the first time the house she had been married into, without ever having met the man who owned it. Fenwick Hall stood black against a bruised October sky, its windows dark, its chimneys cold. But for one thin ribbon of smoke, and the moor rolled away from its walls in every direction, like a sea that had forgotten how to be kind. She had signed her name in a solicitor's office in York 11 days earlier. She had spoken her vows that morning to a proxy, a gray man in a gray coat who had held the ring on the groom's behalf, because the groom would not come south for it. The whole county called her husband the Beast of the North. She was 22 years old, and she did not yet know that the name was a lie told by frightened people, nor that the thin ribbon of smoke came from a room where a man sat every night refusing to sleep. Stay with me through this one. Some stories are quiet on purpose, and this is one of them. She had not chosen it. That is the first thing to understand about how Rosalind came to be standing on that hill with the wind pulling at her plain gray traveling cloak. Her father, Mr. Silas Hale, had been a merchant of moderate fortune and immoderate hope, and both had failed him in the same winter. When the debts came due, there was no money to meet them, only a daughter, and a distant connection had brokered the thing that a man like her father brokers when he has nothing else: a marriage. A settlement of debts in exchange for a bride. The gentleman in the north wanted a wife who would ask no questions and make no demands, and Silas Hale had a daughter who had learned early that questions and demands were luxuries a poor girl could not afford. She had wept once, alone. The night the agreement was signed. Then she had folded the weeping away, as she folded everything, small and flat and out of sight, and she had packed her mother's sewing box and her 3 books and the pressed violet her mother had left inside the smallest of them, and she had come north. The man who opened the door of Fenwick Hall was not her husband. He was a servant, elderly, and stooped, with a face like a walnut and eyes that were kinder than she had any right to expect. Mrs. Potter. Poole, the housekeeper, came behind him with a candle, and it was Mrs. Secondma. Poole, who looked at Rosalind's thin cloak and her cold hands and said, before any word of welcome, that the girl must come inside at once and sit by a fire before she took her death. The kitchen at Fenwick Hall was the one warm room in the whole cold pile of stone, and it was there Mrs. Poole brought her to a settle by the great range and put into her hands a bowl of broth and a heel of bread still warm from the oven. Rosalind had not eaten since the inn at dawn. She had not known she was hungry until the smell of the broth reached her, and then she found her hands were shaking too badly to hold the spoon steady, and she was ashamed of it. And Mrs. Poole pretended not to see. The old woman talked instead, gently, of small things, of the hens and the hard frost coming, and the trouble of keeping candles lit in a house so full of draughts. And under the talk was a kindness that asked nothing, and Rosalind, who had come north braced against cruelty, found the unlooked-for gentleness harder to bear than any unkindness would have been. She ate. She let the warmth come back into her fingers. And she looked about the low, bright room at the copper pans and the strings of dried herbs and the walnut-faced old man mending harness in the corner, and she thought that whatever else this place was, it was not without care in it, and that was more than she had dared to hope for on the hill. They did not speak of the master. Rosalind noticed that the way one notices a held breath in a room. The servants moved through the great cold house with a care that was not fear exactly, but was near to it, and when she asked Mrs. Poole where she might find her husband to pay her respects, the housekeeper's hands went still on the tea things for the length of a heartbeat before she answered that his lordship kept to the east wing and was not to be disturbed. To the household that first evening, Rosalind was a problem that had arrived in a carriage. She heard one of the younger maids say it in the passage, not cruelly, only wearily. The words carrying through a door left ajar. Another poor thing sent up to thaw the master, and him past thawing. The girl had not known she could be hurt. Rosalind sat by the fire in a room too large for one small person, and she looked at the pressed violet in her palm. And she thought, with the flat, clear practicality that was the only defense she had ever been given, that she must simply find a way to be useful. A wife who could not be loved might still be needed. She had been needed before. She knew how it was done. She met him 3 days later, and not by design. She had risen before dawn, unable to sleep in the vast, strange bed, and she had gone down through the sleeping house to the library, because a house with 3 books of her own felt poorer than a house with 1,000 of someone else's. The library at Fenwick Hall ran the whole height of the East Range, shelves climbing into shadow, a tall, cold room that smelled of leather and dust and old smoke. She had a single candle. She was standing on the second rung of the library ladder, with her hand on a volume of Cowper, when a voice came out of the dark behind her, low and even, and without any warmth at all, and asked her what she thought she was doing in his house before the sun was up. She did not fall. She was proud of that afterward. She came down the ladder with the book still in her hand, and she turned, and she saw him. Lord Alaric Vane, 6th Earl of Fenwick, was a tall man, made taller by the way he held himself, as though bracing against a wind only he could feel. His hair was dark and unfashionably long, tied back with a plain ribbon. His coat was good, but old. Across the left side of his face, from the cheekbone to the jaw, ran the pale seam of a healed burn, the skin drawn and smooth and shining faintly in the candlelight, and it was this. She understood at once that the county had made into a monster. She did not flinch from it. She had spent her girlhood among people who flinched, and she had promised herself, on the hill, that she would not be one of them. She told him her name. She told him she had taken a book without asking, and that she was sorry for it. And she watched something move behind his eyes, quick and gone, when she did not look away from the burned side of his face, but met his gaze square, the way one honest person meets another. "Eat something," he said. It was not what she expected. His voice was still cold, still level, but the words were not the words of a beast. "You are too thin, and you have come a long way. And Mrs. Poole tells me you would not take supper. Eat something." Then he turned and was gone into the dark of the house, and Rosalind stood alone in the great library with the Cowper in her hands and her heart going in a way she did not choose and could not explain. That was the first of it. She could not have named it then. Her body had understood something her mind was not yet permitted to know, and it had understood it in the space of a sentence spoken by a cold man in a cold room, and it did not forget. The days that followed had a shape she slowly learned. The Earl kept to the east wing by day and walked the moor at dusk, alone, a dark figure against a darker sky, and the household arranged itself around his absence the way a garden arranges itself around a stone. Rosalind, having no place made for her, began to make one. She found the linen presses in disorder and set them right. She found that Mrs. Poole's eyes were failing, and began to keep the household accounts in her own neat hand, saying nothing of it, only leaving the ledger open on the kitchen table, where the housekeeper could see the sums were done. She found a garden gone to ruin behind the south wall, and began, in the thin autumn light, to clear it. It had been a lady's garden once. She could see that in the bones of it, in the box hedges gone wild, and the stone bench green with moss, and the rose canes climbing over each other in a tangle that had not been pruned in years. She did not know whose garden it had been. She could guess. She said nothing and asked nothing, and each afternoon she went out with a pair of shears she had found rusting in the potting shed, and she cut back a little more of the ruin, her breath white in the cold air, her hands raw through her worn gloves, and slowly, day by day, a shape began to come back out of the wildness. One gray morning she came down to find that someone had oiled and sharpened the shears in the night, and left them clean on the shed bench where she would find them. She stood holding them a long moment. She did not ask who had done it. She had begun to understand that at Fenwick Hall the kindnesses came in the dark, and left no name, and that to name them aloud would be to frighten them away, like putting up a hand too quickly toward a wild thing that had only just consented to come near. The Earl said nothing of any of this. Still, she noticed that the fire in the great library was lit now every morning before she came down, and she had not asked for it, and no one would tell her who had given the order. There was a boy at Fenwick Hall. She had not expected him. His name was Thomas, and he was 6 years old. He was the Earl's ward, the orphan son of a man who had died beside Lord Vane in the same fire that had marked his face. The child was silent in the way that children are not meant to be silent, watchful and small and given to standing at windows. The household loved him helplessly and did not know what to do with him. His guardian, Rosalind observed, could not look at him for longer than a moment, and left the room when the boy was brought in, and this was spoken of by the servants as coldness. She did not think it was coldness. She had seen grief wear that particular face before on her own father. In the winter, everything failed. She began to sit with Thomas. It started with a book, as so much in her life had started with a book. The boy would not come to her at first. He stood at the far window with his back half turned and pretended not to listen. And Rosalind, who had learned patience in a hard school, did not press him. She simply read aloud to the empty room, an old book of beast fables with worn-colored plates, and she read as though she did not care whether anyone heard. And day by day the small figure at the window drifted a little nearer, until one afternoon she felt a slight warmth against her side. His thumb in his mouth, his eyes on the picture of a lion with a thorn in its paw. She did not remark on it. She only turned the page a little so he could see it better, and went on reading, and the child stayed. He asked her, that day, in the small rusty voice he so rarely used, whether the lion in the story was a bad lion or a good one. She told him that he was a frightened one, and that people had thought him bad because they were frightened too, and that the girl in the story was the only one who was not afraid to look at him closely enough to see the thorn. Thomas considered this with the terrible seriousness of a child, and then he said that his guardian had a hurt on his face, and that no one was allowed to look at it. Rosalind said that she looked at it, and that it did not frighten her at all, and the boy went quiet, in a way that was not sorrow, and leaned a little closer, and asked her to read the part about the thorn again. She read to him. In the afternoons in the morning room, and one gray day she looked up mid-sentence to find the Earl standing in the doorway, unseen by the boy, his hand on the frame, watching the two of them, with an expression she was not meant to witness, and which he wiped from his face the instant he knew himself observed. He did not come in. Yet the reading went on after that, every afternoon, and the door was always left ajar, and she understood, without being told, that the door was left ajar for him. I want to tell you about the night the whole thing turned, because it turned on something small. It was the 3rd week of her marriage, and a hard frost had come early. Rosalind woke past midnight to a sound she could not place, a thin, high sound like an animal in distress, and she rose and took her candle and followed it down the freezing passage to the east wing, where she had been told never to go. Ash. The door of a small room stood open. Inside, the boy Thomas sat bolt upright in a narrow bed, his eyes open and unseeing, caught in the grip of a dream he could not wake from, and beside the bed, on his knees on the cold floor in his shirt-sleeves, was the Earl of Fenwick, the terror of the county, the beast of the north. With his ruined face bent close to the child, and his voice gone soft as she had never heard it, saying over and over that the boy was safe, that the fire was out, that no one would be taken, that he was here and he would not leave. He did not hear her. She stood in the dark of the passage, and she watched a man the world called a monster hold a frightened child through the worst of a nightmare, and she felt the last of her careful flatness give way inside her, like ice over a river in a thaw. This was the man she had been bound to, not the story. This. She must have made some small sound, because he looked up. For a moment neither of them spoke. The boy had subsided into true sleep, his breathing evened, and the Earl rose from the floor with a stiffness that spoke of many such nights, and he came out into the passage and drew the door softly closed behind him, so as not to wake the child. "You should not be in this wing," he said. There was no cold in it now. There was only a man caught, seen, stripped of the armor he wore against the whole world, standing in his shirt-sleeves in a freezing corridor with his marked face bare to her candle. "He has bad dreams," she said. It was not a question. Every night the Earl answered, and something in the plainness of it, the exhaustion under it, undid her. He dreams of the fire. He was 3 years old and he does not remember it. Not truly, but his body remembers, and there is nothing I can give him that will take it away. I have tried. He looked away from her toward the closed door. His father died, getting him out. I did not. That is the whole of it. She understood then what the burn had cost him. And it was not his face. It was the man beside him. He had not saved, and the child in the next room who woke screaming for a fire. He could not remember in the years since spent alone in a cold house convincing himself he deserved every mile of the moor's emptiness. The county had made him a beast, because a beast is easier to look at than a grieving man. She saw all of it in the space of a breath, standing in the dark. And she did the only thing her honest heart would let her do. She did not offer comfort in words. She reached out, and she put her hand on his sleeve lightly, the way one steadies something that might otherwise fall. And she left it there. He went very still. Beneath her fingers she felt the warmth of him through the linen and the small betraying tremor he could not command away. And for the length of several heartbeats the two of them stood in the frozen passage and did not move and did not speak, and the whole cold house held its breath around them. Then he stepped back carefully and told her she would take a chill and that she must go to bed. "Come," he said, and took the candle from her hand, so his own steadier grip could light her back along the passage, and if the taking of the candle was an excuse to walk beside her in the dark, neither of them said so. After that night the house was not the same, though nothing in it changed that a stranger could have named. The Earl began to take his breakfast in the morning room where Rosalind sat with her accounts. He said little, yet he was there. He began to walk the moor at dusk with the two of them beside him, Thomas between them, small and warm, and slowly beginning to speak. There was an evening she remembered above the others. A storm had come down off the moor, and the wind was worrying at the windows, and Thomas would not settle, and the three of them had ended in the great library with the fire built high, the boy asleep at last across his guardian's knees. The Earl sat very still so as not to wake him. Rosalind sat opposite with her mending, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were the fire and the wind and the child's slow breathing. Then the Earl said quietly, not looking up from the sleeping boy, that she had done for the household in 6 weeks what he had not managed in 3 years, and that he did not know how she had done it, and that he had stopped trying to understand, and only wished to say that he was grateful. It was the longest speech she had ever had from him. She said that she had done nothing but what any woman would do. He looked at her then across the firelight, and said that she was wrong, that most would have done a great deal less, and called it charity, and that she had never once called it anything at all. She had no answer for that. She bent her head over her mending so he would not see her face, and her needle went still in her hand, and the fire burned down, and something between them that had been frozen a long time went on quietly thawing in the warm, dark room. Rosalind found that she knew where the Earl was in any room without looking, that the air changed when he entered it, that her own pulse had learned the sound of his uneven step on the stairs. She did not permit herself to name what this was. She had been given, not chosen. She held to that as to a rope over water. A man might be kind to a wife he had bought and still not want her, and she would not be a fool who mistook decency for love, and shamed them both. But she watched him watch her when he thought she did not see. She watched his hand still on the back of her chair one evening, hovering, not quite touching her shoulder, before he drew it back and bade her good night in a voice not quite steady. And on a bright cold afternoon in the ruined garden, when she stood on a low wall to reach a branch and lost her footing, he caught her without thought, both hands at her waist, and set her down, and did not at once let go, and she looked up into his marked face at a distance of inches and forgot entirely how to breathe. Neither of them moved. His thumb shifted, the smallest fraction, against the cloth at her side. Her hand had come up to rest flat against his chest, and she felt his heart going hard and fast under her palm, as fast as her own, and the truth of it passed between them without a single word, the body telling what the mouth would not. Then a servant called across the garden, and the moment broke, and they stepped apart like two people who had been caught at something, though they had done nothing at all but stand too close in the light, It could not last. This fragile, untried peace, the world that had made him a beast, had not finished with either of them. The blow came from the south, in a letter, and then in a person. The person was Mr. Persson. Julian Crail, a cousin of the late Countess, a smooth, handsome man with a smile that never reached his eyes and a claim he had been nursing for years. He arrived at Fenwick Hall uninvited on a raw November afternoon with a manservant and a great deal of luggage and the settled air of a man who means to stay. He explained over dinner, in a voice pitched to carry, only come to see how his poor cousin's boy was being managed, and to satisfy himself that the child's interests were protected, given the— and here he paused delicately, given the household's reputation. Rosalind understood the man within an hour of his arrival. He wanted the guardianship of Thomas, and through the guardianship the administration of the boy's considerable inheritance, and he had come to build the case that the Earl of Fenwick, disfigured, reclusive, feared through the county, was no fit keeper of a child. He was polished, and he was patient, and he was in the way of such men entirely certain he was in the right. That evening he watched Rosalind across the table with a slow, assessing look, and said to the company, but meaning her, that it was a wonder the Earl had found any woman at all to take him, and that he supposed a merchant's daughter in debt could not be particular. He said it smiling, the dismissive verdict spoken aloud, in the master's own dining room. She kept her eyes on her plate, and her hands quiet in her lap, and she did not give him the flinch he was fishing for. But she saw the Earl's hand close hard around the stem of his glass, and she saw him master it, and she understood that Crail had learned in a single evening exactly where the man was vulnerable, and it was not himself. It was her, and it was the boy. The days that followed were a slow siege. Crail was never openly rude. He was worse than rude. He was reasonable, gathering his small cruelties into a shape that would look, to a magistrate, like concern. He drew the servants into careless conversation and wrote down what they said. He noted the Earl's dusk walks alone on the moor and named them the wanderings of an unsound mind. He remarked, always gently, on the burn, on the solitude, on the strange, quiet child, and he built from these true things a false and deadly picture. And he watched Rosalind always, with the eye of a man appraising a weakness he means to use. She tried once to meet him on his own ground. She came upon him in the gallery one afternoon making notes in a small book, and she asked him plainly what it was he wanted, for she had learned that a thing named aloud loses some of its power to work in the dark. Crail only smiled, and closed his little book and said that he wanted nothing but the child's good, and that he was surprised she should ask, unless she had some cause to fear what an honest inquiry might turn up. He let the words hang. Then he said softly that she seemed a sensible young woman, and that a sensible young woman in her position, bought out of debt and married to a ruined recluse, might do well to think of where she would go when the court removed the boy and the scandal broke. For a countess with no fortune and no friends and a monster for a husband would find the world a very cold place indeed. He said it kindly, as though offering advice. It was the second voicing of the verdict, spoken now in private, meant to make her doubt the ground beneath her own feet. She did not answer him. She went instead to the ruined garden, cut roses in the cold, until her hands stopped shaking, and she understood that Crail had shown her, in that gallery, exactly what he was, and that a man who would frighten a woman alone was not a man who feared any court, but only one who feared being seen for what he was. She resolved that she would not give him the fear he wanted. She had spent too long being small. She was done with it. He found his moment at the assembly. The county held a subscription ball each November in the old assembly rooms at Marish, and the Earl of Fenwick had not attended one in 7 years. That he chose to go this year was Crail's doing, and Rosalind knew it, for Crail had said sweetly at dinner that it would look very strange to the neighborhood if the new countess were kept hidden away, like something the family was ashamed of, and the Earl, who could bear any slight against himself, but not one against her, had said in a hard, flat voice that his wife would go to the ball and be seen and be honored as his countess, and that had been precisely what Crail wanted, a public arena, a stage on which to break them. You have perhaps guessed by now where the evening was tending. Stay for it anyway, for the how of a thing is often worth more than the whether. I would not have you miss it. The night before the ball, the Earl came to her in the morning room, where she sat late over the accounts, and he stood a while by the window without speaking. And then he said, in the flat, hard voice he used when a thing cost him to say it, that she need not go if she did not wish to, that he would not have her made a show of for the county's sport, and that Creel's opinion of what looked strange was no law. He was bound by Rosalind set down her pen. She said that she would go, and that she would go gladly, and that she was not ashamed to be seen at his side, whatever the county chose to whisper. She watched the words land. She watched him turn from the window and look at her as though she had said something he had waited a very long time to hear, and had stopped expecting, and for a moment she thought he might cross the room to her. He did not. He bade her good night in a voice not entirely steady, and went out. And she sat a long while after, with the accounts forgotten under her hand. Rosalind wore the one good gown she owned, a soft green muslin remade twice, and Mrs. Pride cool dressed her hair with her own trembling hands and pinned the pressed violet, dried these 2 years into a small brooch at her breast, so that some small part of her mother might go with her into that bright, hard room. The assembly rooms at Marish blazed with candlelight and were full of the county's finest, and every head turned when the Earl of Fenwick entered with his young wife on his arm, and the whispering ran round the walls like wind through wheat. There is the beast. There is the girl they sold him. Look at the poor creature. Look at the face of him. However does she bear it? She bore it by lifting her chin and looking at no one but him. Creel had prepared his ground well. He had spoken to the right people, planted the right doubts, and midway through the evening in the crowded card-room with half the county in earshot, he sprang the whole of it. He rose, and in a voice of wounded reasonableness he declared that he could stay silent no longer, that the county must know the truth, that little Thomas was being raised in fear and darkness by a man unfit to keep a dog, let alone a child, and that he, Creel, meant to petition the court for the boy's guardianship before harm was done. He turned to the room and he said that everyone present had eyes, and could see for themselves what manner of man the Earl of Fenwick was. And then, because cruelty always overreaches, he turned to Rosalind, standing pale and still at her husband's side, and he said, loud enough for all of it to carry, that even the wife had been bought, a bankrupt's daughter who had never in her life been chosen for anything but her price. The room went silent. This was the dark moment, and it landed with the full weight of every eye in the county turned upon her. She felt the old flatness rise in her, the girl who folded herself small and out of sight. And she felt the pressed violet at her breast, and she thought of a man on his knees on a cold floor in the middle of the night, saying, "You are safe, the fire is out," and she found that she could not fold herself away. Not this time, not while a good man was being called a beast. In front of the people who had invented the name, she stepped forward before the Earl could speak. She did not raise her voice. She had never in her life needed to raise her voice, and she did not begin now. She said into the silence that Mr. Creel spoke of a home he had entered 11 days ago, and left every night to sleep soundly in the best guest chamber. She said that she had lived in that home. She said that she had seen the Earl of Fenwick go on his knees in the dark, night after night, to hold a frightened child through dreams that no one else could reach, and that she had never in her life, in any fine house or poor one, seen a gentler thing. Her voice did not shake. The room did not breathe. She said that the county had decided a burned face made a monster, because a monster is easier than a grieving man, and that she was ashamed for all of them, herself included, who had ever believed it. And she said that she had been sold. Yes, that much was true, but that she had not been chosen for her price by the man she was speaking of. She had been chosen, she said, for nothing at all, and given everything. And she knew the difference now, and so did every honest soul in the room. Then she stopped because she had said what was true, and there was no more to say. And into the silence that followed, the Earl of Fenwick crossed the room to stand beside her, and took her hand before all of them, and spoke. "She is my wife," And I chose her, he said. 6 words. Level and low, and carrying to every corner of the bright, hard room. He said no more than that. He did not answer Krail's charges point by point, did not raise his voice, did not match the cruelty with cruelty. He simply stood with his marked face bare to the candlelight and his wife's hand in his, and told the county the one thing that undid every lie in a single stroke. And the truth of it, spoken plainly by a man who had never once lied to spare himself, went through the room like a change in the weather. It was old Dr. Merrow who spoke first, the physician who had tended the boy's father as he died and dressed the Earl's burns after, a man the county trusted. He said, from the edge of the crowd, that he had been in and out of Fenwick Hall these 3 years, and that he had never seen the child other than well-kept and well-loved, and that Mr. Catterder, Krail had never once visited the boy in all that time, until inheritance made him tender. Then the vicar's wife said she had heard the new countess had set the parish poor list to rights within a fortnight of coming north. And a farmer's wife said the Earl had forgiven her family's rent the winter her husband broke his leg, and had told no one, and one by one in small plain voices the county began to take back the beast it had made. Julian Krail looked about him for the room he had walked into and could not find it. His case was built on a picture, and the picture had cracked, and a smooth, patient man who has lost the confidence of a room has nothing left to stand on. He said something about pursuing the matter through proper channels, and it fell into the silence and died there. For everyone present understood now what the proper channels would find. He left Marish that night. He left the county within the week. Before he went, his own solicitor, a decent man ashamed of the work, quietly withdrew, and the petition was never filed. The hierarchy that had come for them had corrected itself, not with vengeance, but with the slow, plain justice of people remembering what they had known all along and chosen to forget. Rosalind and Alaric did not stay for the dancing. They went out into the cold, clear November night, and he handed her up into the carriage and sat beside her, not across from her, and somewhere on the dark road home without a word, her head came to rest against his shoulder, and his hand closed over hers, and neither of them moved for the whole long journey through the dark. He spoke only once. He said her name. Rosalind. Only that, the first time he had ever used it, and the sound of it in his low voice was worth more than any speech, and she understood that she had been, from some moment she could not name, entirely and freely chosen. The winter closed over Fenwick Hall, and it was not the same house that had swallowed her carriage in October. Snow came in December, and lay deep and blue-white across the moor. And the windows of the great house that had been dark were lit now, warm squares of gold scattered across the black face of the hall, because Rosalind had opened the shut rooms, one by one, and let the light back in. Thomas still dreamed, but less, and on the worst nights there were 2 of them now. To kneel beside his bed, and he had begun to laugh in the daytime, a small rusty sound at first, like a hinge, long unused, and then more freely, until the house that had forgotten the noise of a happy child learned it again. On a still evening near Christmas, with snow falling soft past the library windows and the fire high in the grate, Rosalind sat with her husband in the great room where she had first come down before dawn and found him in the dark. Thomas was asleep upstairs. The Earl had a book open and unread on his knee, and he was watching her across the firelight with an expression he no longer troubled to hide, and she had in her hand the smallest of her 3 books, the one her mother had left her, and between its pages, where it had lain pressed and waiting these 2 years and more, was the violet. She took it out and looked at it, the small dried flower that had come north with her when she had nothing else, that had gone to the ball pinned at her breast, that had been her mother's small stubborn word for love against a hard world. She did not put it away again. She rose and crossed the warm room and set it without a word on the open page of her husband's unread book, a plain and pressed and long-carried thing, given freely now to a man who had been chosen for nothing at all, and had turned out to be everything. He looked at the flower a long moment. "Wall," Then he closed the book over it, gently so as not to crush what was already so fragile, and he reached up and drew her down beside him, and the snow came down past the tall, dark windows onto the sleeping moor, and in the warm gold room the beast the county had feared held his wife against his heart, and was, at last, only a man who had been loved back into the light. If Rosalind's story stayed with you, stay a moment in the quiet of it before you go, and if it moved you, leave a word to say so. Thank you for staying until the end.